So let's just give folks another minute here to join. In the meantime, I can just do some high-level introductions. So today's presenters are Mark Laliberti. Mark is the Technical Security Operations Manager at WatchGuard Technologies and an author at Secplicity, which is a multimedia platform all about cybersecurity for the IT professional. Mark speaks regularly at speaking appearances and contributes regularly to online IT publications and is considered a thought leader in providing security guidance. So we're happy to have him here speaking to us today. And we're also joined by Chris Fernanda. Chris is Success's cybersecurity architect and works in our in-house security operations center. And he's really the brains behind all the awesome cybersecurity stuff that Success does. So with that, Mark, I'll kick it off to you so you can get started.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Vanessa. And real quick to you folks, thanks for all hopping on. I love answering questions, by the way. So throughout this, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat. I've got a little window up here, and I'm sure Vanessa will let me know if I missed anything as well. But yeah, with that, we're here to talk about securing the hybrid workforce and really a focus on how strong endpoint protection and EDR can help defend your networks and your endpoints against the latest cyber threats. Before we jump in, just real quick about me. I've been at WatchGuard about 9.5 years, almost 10 years now, in a few different roles and responsibilities. Right now, though, I manage our security operations team as well as run our threat lab, which we call our WatchGuard Threat Lab, our threat research team, where our job every day is just to keep our finger on the pulse of cybersecurity. We get threat intelligence from our Firebox appliances deployed throughout the world, our endpoints, both from Panda 8360 and WatchGuard EPDR, third-party feeds, our own research, and kind of bring that all together and try and paint a picture of what the threat landscape is, and then provide actionable tips on how to defend yourselves, your systems, your users from the latest cyber threats that are out there. I come from a lifetime of traditional hacking, so I describe that as ripping apart every single electronics device I ever find to see how it works. My main specialties now are in network security, working at WatchGuard, and also IoT is a big passion project of mine. I love IoT hacking. I've got a stack of devices right there in the corner that I bought off Amazon, where during my downtime, I'll try and find vulnerabilities in them and work with manufacturers to get them fixed, just to try and do a little bit to improve the security of these IoT devices that keep coming out there. So enough about me. Let's go on to our agenda for today. And we're going to start by just going over some threat landscape statistics for the hybrid workforce and for our organizations as we start to return to this kind of new normal of our employees coming in and out of the office on any given day. Then we're going to talk about the explosion of fileless malware over the past few years. And I'll give you a good overview of what fileless malware is, how it differs from traditional malware threats out there, and how attackers are leveraging this new class of threat in order to make these really highly evasive attacks against endpoints. And then we will dive into defending against these evolving threats and how a combination of a zero trust architecture going forward and strong endpoint protection and endpoint detection response can help secure your organization and your systems. So again, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt along the way. I'll try and peek over and see if any come in. And with that, let's go ahead and start with just an overview of the cyber threat landscape for this year and the years going forward. And the first thing I want to focus on is when it comes to cybersecurity, a lot of organizations are kind of putting all their eggs in one basket, and that basket being prevention, meaning you spend all of your resources, all your money, all of your time on trying to stop a cyber attack and not enough on trying to identify a existing attack and responding to it quickly. And that culminates in stats like this, where we see from a recent study from IBM and the Pohman Institute, organizations took on average 207 days last year to identify that they had been the victim of a breach. So because they're focusing all their time and attention on stopping that attack, I mean, let's pause for a second. I work for a cybersecurity company, and I would love to tell you that if you buy all of our products and all of our services and turn everything on, you're unhackable. But unhackable is just not a thing. Like there could be a user that brings in a thumb drive, someone that picks something up off the ground, some really sophisticated phish that comes in, a zero-day exploit. I mean, long story short, there are a multitude of ways for something to slip through the cracks. which means that you need to be watching out for those events and responding to them quickly and efficiently. And if you fail to take into account that detection and response portion of it, you're going to end up like this, where it's taking 8-9 months to identify that you've been the victim of a breach. And during that time, threat actors are going to be sitting on your networks trying to move laterally or elevate their privileges because by default.
Yeah, I just did the staff mobile one.
Oh, can we go ahead and
I don't know,
mute
might
real
have
quick
been
if we
Could be just
do that.
good stuff.
Got it. So during that time, attackers are going to be trying to move to the most critical resources on your network. So typically an attack starts by going after the weakest link in your defense. So that could be an unpatched web browser from a user in your accounting department, or maybe a system that you left exposed to the internet and forgot that you had remote access still enabled to it. And once they get a hold of that system, then they're going to try and gain other credentials, whether by scraping them out of memory off that host, or phishing internal employees, or just attacking now internal resources as well, and try and move on to the big bucks, going after your customer databases, your intellectual property, whatever is valuable to you. And then once they've gained that, they will typically line up some sort of coup de grace, like ransomware seems to be still in favor these days, and kind of have this exit strategy then where they will encrypt all your data, exfiltrate out anything that might be worth something on the dark web, and then potentially do a double extortion against you. So again, 207 days to identify the threat actor's activity on your network. And even then, it still took organizations on average 73 days to clean up after the fact. So we're saying 9 to 10 months now from the point of initial infection to the point where you've kicked them off of your network. And that is far too long for them to be sitting there. And one of the reasons they're able to do this is because malware threats these days are becoming even more evasive than ever. So one of the things that my team in the threat research department tracks every single quarter in our security reports, every single day on our threat landscape page on secplicity.org, is this number called the 0-day malware number. And to the technical people out there, this isn't a 0-day exploit where it's an attack against a unpatched vulnerability. When we say 0-day malware, we are talking about malware that doesn't have a signature. So it gets past traditional signature-based anti-malware engines. Now, that could be because it's brand new malware, something that an attacker literally just coded up that morning. Or more often, it's because they're using tools like packers and cryptors and other evasive frameworks that are available for low cost or for free on the dark web or even just underground forums, and running old malware payloads through them to make them no longer match any known signatures. There's a really popular tool called Amber, for example, that's available on GitHub. It's open source. Anyone can go download it for free. And you can run a 3-year-old copy of WannaCry ransomware through it, for example. And it will make it evasive enough that it can get past most signature-based detections. Mostly because these tools work by kind of masking the malware in a way where it's really difficult to block it without a whole lot of collateral damage. Like the anti-malware engine will say, yeah, that's kind of suspicious, but if I start blocking something that looks like that, I'm going to block all these other legitimate applications. And as we all know, once you start blocking a bunch of legitimate applications, end users are going to have a really rough day and come pounding on your door to fix the issue. So that's how they're able to sneak past these traditional anti-malware engines, meaning you need to instead look at engines that use behavioral detection, run through a machine learning model to try and predict whether it's malicious or not, because otherwise you're missing potentially 70% of all malware out there. And this seems pretty high. It's not the highest we've seen it. Like for Q1 of this year, it was right around 76%, I believe. So like 3/4 of all malware out there could get past traditional anti-malware engines if that's the only layer of anti-malware you're relying on. Another interesting trend we saw, this was from our Q4 2020 report, where we were tracking how malware infections originated on an endpoint. So specifically, what is the application or exploit or technique they used to initiate that malware-based attack? And we bucketed the main big ones into certain categories. It's like Office attacks started with exploiting a vulnerability in Word or PowerPoint or Excel. Browser-based ones went after vulnerabilities in web browsers or plugins for your browsers. Java and Adobe are still pretty big ones because those applications tend to have a lot of functionality, which enables a lot of potential security holes as well. But the big one was scripts. So we're talking fileless malware attacks that use living off the land techniques that we'll go over a bit more in just a bit, where they initiate with something like a PowerShell script or a Visual Basic script or a JavaScript file attached to an email. And these script-based attacks have been skyrocketing over the past few years. In fact, when we showed this graph in our report, we had to do it in two different ways. This first one being the logarithmic scale, so you can kind of see how the others were doing over the past few years. Because when we go on the linear scale, like a flat scale for this, you can see just how massively the increase in script-based fileless malware threats have been in just the last year. And to kind of spill the beans on our first half security report coming out in a few weeks, they're continuing to rise in this year as well because they're really effective. They're good at evading traditional anti-malware engines. They're good at using the tools that come with your endpoint to carry out all of their malicious actions effectively, all without ever touching storage on your system. They often reside solely in memory, which makes them even more difficult to detect. And we'll get into that in just a little bit as well, too. And then finally, one of the other trends we have to watch out for this year and the coming years is this hybrid workforce. Like as we're starting to come back into the office, more often than not, it's not going to be full time. I know at WatchGuard, we're going to be transitioning to a flexible model where basically no one is required to come into headquarters anymore. If you want to come in and check out a desk for the day or an office for the day, you can. If you want to continue working remotely, we know that you're capable of doing that as well. And most analysts are expecting that's going to become effectively this new normal now, where organizations should expect a significant chunk of their workforce to be hybrid or remote or in the office or whatever on any given day. And what this means is we can no longer rely on that strong network perimeter to keep our systems internally safe. And to be honest, like you really never could rely on that. We should have been following zero trust architectures from the get-go, but a lot of organizations kind of leaned on this strong outer defense and didn't put as much focus on the endpoints themselves. Now with this hybrid model where half the time your employees might not be on the network at all, they'll be working remotely from a coffee shop, from home, with their own home network, sharing it with their kids, doing who knows what on the internet. We need to make sure we're focusing on securing those endpoints too, so that A, they're safe from cyber attack on their own, and B, when they come back into the office, they don't track mud into the house with them and allow one of those infections to come in and spread around behind that perimeter. And we'll discuss a bit more about how that might happen and some defenses you can do to protect that a little bit later as well, too. So now let's move on to focus on fileless malware itself. And we should start this by kind of discussing the difference between fileless malware and traditional malware. Let's start with traditional. So normal malware infections that have been around for decades now, they have all their malicious code, all their bad stuff, all their actions that is contained in this typically an executable file that gets saved to your hard drive or solid state drive or whatever on your computer. And those are pretty easy for even traditional endpoint protection to identify and delete. They're constantly scanning your hard drive, constantly scanning file downloads, running them against signatures and heuristics. And if there's a match, they can delete that malware. And once you remove that from your storage, you clean up the malware infection. Your computer is no longer infected. Fileless malware, on the other hand, doesn't touch your storage at all. Instead, it resides solely in memory on your system. And there's a few different ways for it to get in there. One of them tends to start with a file, like an Office document that has macros that can launch a script, or it can start by exploiting a vulnerability in an application and using that vulnerability then to inject their malicious code into the memory of another process. And fileless malware is significantly more difficult to detect for endpoint protection, especially endpoint protection that isn't monitoring the memory and existing processes on your computer. Because it never touches that hard drive, there's no file for your endpoint protection to scan. Because it doesn't download itself through traditional means often, your endpoint protection doesn't know how to identify it over the network traffic. So instead, you need to make sure that you're watching memory footprints and processes existing on the computer to look for suspicious activity. Now, when it comes to fileless malware, it's actually been around for quite some time in various forms and flavors. We saw memory resident viruses from the 80s. Code Red and SQL Slammer were technically fileless malware worms in the early 2000s. There were living off the land attacks today, though, are really where they're starting to pick off, where attackers are using the tools built into our computers like PowerShell or NetSH, and then using these kits like PowerSploit or PowerWare that, again, are available for free on GitHub repositories, on underground forums, wherever, to abuse these built-in tools to do every kind of action that they need to on that host, using network activity connections to download additional payloads, using reflective injection modules in order to inject these payloads into other processes, again, all without ever touching storage. These days, their techniques are mostly with library injection and memory injection. So again, taking malicious code and sticking it in the memory of another process to try and hide it, and then running it from there. We see them, like I said, using legitimate Windows tools where, as an administrator, you more often than not can't just block PowerShell from running. So instead, you have to make sure you're paying attention to what it is running and try and block that malicious activity while allowing the legitimate activity. We're also seeing these attacks attached to zero-day exploits where, let's say there's a vulnerability in your web browser and an attacker tricks you into visiting a malicious website hosting an exploit kit. That could exploit that flaw in your browser and use that to gain code execution. And then from there, pivot and inject their code into somewhere else so that even if you close your browser, they still have persistence somewhere else on the system. It really started picking up around 2016 is where I'd say this trend kind of started, and it's just been skyrocketing from there. And I mentioned it's not always completely fileless. In fact, it often starts with an Office document that loads up macros or an exploit or something to launch Visual Basic code to then launch PowerShell. But how that differs from traditional malware is that once you delete that Office document, they don't care at all. Like as soon as you've run that Office document and it's run the code, you could delete it and nothing happens to the malware. It's already gained persistence and memory on your system. We've seen these PowerShell-based threats specifically increase significantly over just the past few years, like 460% in 2019, even more in 2020. And so far, based off the trends that we're seeing right now, it's going to continue increasing this year as well. Now, some of these attacks come in different flavors and forms. I can give you a few examples here. One of the ones that started picking up, I'd say in 2018, 2019, were these attacks that leveraged DDE. So if you're not familiar with dynamic data execution, a great example of it in use is if you take a Excel spreadsheet and copy and paste it into a Word document. You can often update that Excel spreadsheet and it also updates the Word document copy. That's using DDE to facilitate that communication. And attackers are using this now in Office documents fairly often because it's kind of the next evolution of macro-based malware, where if we get a macro-laced document these days, there's that big yellow security ribbon at the top that says, security alert, this contains macros, you probably shouldn't enable this. And our end users, our employees, everyone's starting to finally catch on that, okay, maybe I don't hit that enable macro button because there's that big scary yellow security ribbon. With DDE, however, it can do a lot of the same stuff that macros can. Like you could use it to copy and paste data between Word and Excel, or you could use it to launch command prompt and then launch, let's say, PowerShell with a embedded script to then get a foothold on the system and then download whatever modules you need. And the problem with DDE is you don't get that yellow security ribbon at the top. You get this little gray box right here that says this document contains links that may refer to other files. Do you want to update this document with the data from those linked files? And to a untrained user, if I saw this, like I'd have no idea that this was a security warning. I might just hit yes because, yeah, I want this document to work. And if you hit yes, it allows DDE to execute. And then again, it could launch PowerShell in the background without you knowing, load up PowerSploit, and then it's basically game over from there. We recently onboarded a few new customers. I guess this wasn't super recently, it was last year, where we were able to see some of these fileless attacks kind of take place after the fact. Basically, they brought us on board, installed endpoint protection, and then through our monitoring and trying to gain a baseline of that host, we actually noticed some malicious activity and were able to go have our threat lab investigate. And we actually found some ongoing living off the land attacks. The first example was super interesting, where it all started, we found, where a threat actor was able to compromise credentials for a SQL database server. So Microsoft SQL, They just gained access to the database itself. Using those credentials, though, they enabled the XP command shell procedure, which basically lets you use those database credentials to run commands on that underlying Microsoft server. They then used that access and copied PowerShell to a different directory. And this was an evasive technique. Basically, a lot of endpoint protection will look for PowerShell running on one of these database servers. But if it does it just based off the name and the executable path, it might miss it if it's suddenly not PowerShell.exe and instead it's sysdo.exe in the temp directory. They then used PowerShell to download this or to run this kind of obfuscated dropper here, where I redacted a bit of it. But if we deobfuscate it, you can actually see what they're trying to do. It's pretty simple. They open up a network connection, download a text file called nc.text, and then run it in PowerShell. And if we look at that text file, it's actually a slightly modified version of PowerSploit's reflective injection module. And what PowerSploit with this module is able to do is it has a embedded malware payload in it, and then it can take that, stick it in the memory of another process, and then execute it. Again, all without ever touching the storage device on this SQL database. It turns out that for this particular customer, they got the lucky end of the stick, and that this whole thing, all it did was just inject a crypto miner into the memory of one of their other processes and started running, which, a crypto miner on your database server is not ideal. That's going to be sucking off a lot of resources. But like I would say, it is better than the alternative, which is typically ransomware, which would have been a nightmare to deal with. We had another recent attack that we were able to identify while onboarding someone that was even more interesting. So this one, we actually identified they had compromised credentials on a single host. And using those credentials, they ran this command, which it looks pretty complicated, but we'll kind of go through it piece by piece. First, they spun up basically a web module, an ActiveX module, to download a Visual Basic script from this domain. Then they confirmed that the download was successful. They just checked to see, okay, an HTTP 200 status response means A-OK. If it was successful, it executed that script using the Windows scripting engine, which is cscript.exe. If it wasn't successful, though, it would identify the architecture of the host. So was it 32-bit or 64-bit? And then download the appropriate PowerShell file for that operating system and then execute that instead. And in this case, this was PowerSploit as well. Attackers these days, again, are getting even more sophisticated, where just by running a command like this on a host, all without saving something to storage, even though these are downloading scripts, technically they reside solely in memory, they're able to execute these attacks all without touching storage. So if you're not watching for these commands, you're going to miss the threats. Another one that we should all watch out for, if you've been following Microsoft updates, as you should be, you probably saw this vulnerability pop up earlier. I guess it was last week now. Microsoft just patched it yesterday as of this webinar right now, where it was actually a code execution vulnerability in this module used by Microsoft Office. Technically, the MS HTML module is also used by Internet Explorer, but I'm going to go out on a limb here and say most of you probably don't use Internet Explorer, so you're probably safe there. But in Microsoft Office, basically all that you had to do was open up a tainted Office document that was laced with this exploit. And if you disabled protected mode, like if you hit that enable editing button, or for some reason you had protected mode disabled globally on your network, which you shouldn't do, it would execute right there as soon as you open that document, and then potentially launch PowerShell, go and grab another stager, and then start its attack from there. The reason I wanted to highlight this is because Office exploits like this one are like a gold mine for threat actors. There's another one from 2017 in another module in Excel and Word called the equation editor that still to this day, 4 years later, we see pop up in our top 10 malware by volume almost every single quarter. Because it turns out people aren't really good at keeping Office updated with the latest security patches. And again, that means all it takes is one really well-crafted phish to end up in a user's inbox, them opening that up and potentially enabling editing on it, and it's game over from there. The attacker can launch one of these fileless threats from that point, And it doesn't matter what you do with that Office document after the fact, they've already gained a foothold. So that was a lot. I know got a bit technical, got a bit scary. Let's all collectively take a deep breath, and then we'll talk about defending against these threats that are out there. And the first step is really, it boils down to a defense in depth. Like, I'm going to be talking a lot about endpoint protection and endpoint detection response and how it can help you, but that isn't the silver bullet. There is no silver bullet in security. Instead, you need multiple layers of defense, from the endpoint to the perimeter in the office to training in between, to try and catch these evasive threats, so that if it slips past one of them, you have another layer behind there in order to pick up the slack, basically. And even on the endpoint itself, this is multiple layers. So endpoint protection, EPP, to try and protect and defend that host. And then endpoint detection response, or EDR, to, again, pick up the slack, look for potentially malicious activity that made it past that protection, and quickly respond and remediate that host before it becomes a major incident. When it comes to EPP and EDR, there's a few things that you absolutely must have in order for it to be effective. The first is proactive behavioral detection. And what I mean by this is the opposite of signature-based detection. Now, signature-based anti-malware has a place. Our solutions have that as one single module in it as well, because signature-based detections are really good at quickly and efficiently identifying known threats. But as you saw earlier, potentially 70% of all malware out there can get past that signature-based detection, which means it isn't enough. So instead, you need to make sure that the engine will look at the behaviors of applications as they run. What are they doing? Is it spinning up Windows encryption libraries? Is it enumerating your file system? These are all potential red flags it can raise to lock down that process and stop it before it's able to execute. Another great example of this was during the recent Kaseya incidents, where if you followed the details of how that Kaseya breach actually happened, basically the attackers were just able to run a command on these affected hosts. You can't just block command prompt on Windows. You'll break a lot of stuff. So instead, you need to watch the command prompt process to see what's going on. Run it through engines to identify, okay, is that particular command triggering interesting activity that might be malicious? Well, then we need to block that process and kill it. You also want to make sure that you're using something that has machine learning or artificial intelligence. And I know that's like a marketing buzzword, and it makes me cringe every time I hear artificial intelligence in the world of security, because it's all just computer code still. But it still has a place. These machine learning models are designed with millions and millions of known goodware and known malware to train them and have them accurately predict whether something's going to be malicious or not, so that you don't have to rely just on signatures. You can also quickly run it through this model just as fast and get a thumbs up or a thumbs down on if it's going to be good or bad. You also want to make sure that your specifically detection response engine is watching processes and memory on that host, not just files that get downloaded, but existing processes as well. That way, if calculator.exe starts spinning up Windows encryption libraries, you can probably get a little head start and see, oh, maybe calculator doesn't need encryption libraries. That's a red flag. Potentially, I should watch this process. If it does anything else suspicious, let's kill it and quarantine anything it's touched. And then finally, you want to make sure that you've got something that does what we call 100% attestation. And what we mean by that is every single file or action that that host does gets run through this engine and comes back with a yes, it's fine, or no, it's bad. Every single one. If it's unknown, you can often put these engines into what's called lock mode, which will prevent it from running for a short period of time until it's able to get a definitive thumbs up or thumbs down, often by a human being, somewhere doing a reverse engineering against it. But basically, you want to make sure that you're watching everything that happens on that host and letting it get a thumbs up or a thumbs down before it's able to run. That is the only way that you're going to have a fighting chance against these evasive malware threats that are out there. And it's not just EPP. You should also look into adopting a zero trust approach to security. What we mean by that is traditionally, we've typically relied on having this strong outer shell of a perimeter. But once you get past that, it's kind of soft and chewy on the inside, and attackers can move around laterally and potentially access resources that they shouldn't have access to. When we talk about zero trust, we're saying instead of that, never trust any endpoint on your system, any user, always verify. That means another way of describing that is assume the breach. So assume that your user internally or connecting with a VPN is malicious. Assume they've been compromised. And then with that assumption, what can you do to watch their activity, monitor their access, restrict their access to sensitive resources that they shouldn't have access to regardless, and quickly respond to actual malicious activity. When it comes to zero trusts, it's pretty simple to at least get started. Basically, you just identify what services your users are accessing. So what databases, source code repository, what platforms you're using. Identify the users themselves, group them together with different privileges. So maybe your accounting team shouldn't have access to the source code server. Maybe your developers shouldn't have access to the customer database, so on and so forth. And then you identify how those users are connecting. So maybe if they're coming in on a corporate issued laptop like mine, they have a little bit more access than if they were connecting on a personal laptop or a phone, for example. And once you've identified all these, then assume that no one can be completely trusted, segment your services away, and then start to tackle it by first making sure you've got strong identification of users and devices. So what we mean by that is multi-factor authentication and strong identity protection. Then provide that secure access once you've verified that I am Mark. I have, with reasonable certainty, this is Mark connecting from Mark's laptop. Okay, in that case, I can give them access to the red team tools for the security research team. Then, once you've given that access, continue monitoring. So visibility ties in here so that if suddenly Mark tries to go access the customer relation database, we can raise some red flags and say, hey, that's not typical Mark activity. Maybe we should investigate a little further and see if Mark isn't actually Mark in this case. When it comes to building that, really, again, it boils down to strong identity framework. So pairing that with Active Directory or LDAP, if you have that, in order to get group permissions, for example, backing it by multi-factor authentication so you can have, with reasonable certainty, proof that this is me. And then tying that in with what we call a segmentation gateway, which is just the latest term for your NGFW or UTM or firewall, as I and others still like to call it. And when you set that up, again, deny by default architecture, so restrict access by default, and then allow access only to resources that users should have access to. And it takes a bit of work, but with this kind of setup paired with strong endpoint protection for those users that are moving in and out of your office, you don't have to rely just on your perimeter again. Now you can secure the individual hosts and allow that access that they need to all of your trusted resources. So with that, I'll hand it over to Chris to go ahead and pick up from here. If you have any questions, again, stick them in the chat or feel free to reach out to me if you don't like asking them in public, kind of like me. With that, I'll hand it off to Chris here.
All right, thank you, Mark. Just shared my slides here. Hopefully they're appearing. Okay. So my name's Chris. I work at Success, and I'm going to go through a few real-world attack scenarios that we've been involved with remediating for some local small businesses. So just real quick, again, I'm Chris Vananda. I've worked at Success for about 16 years, and I'm a cybersecurity architect. I have a couple industry certifications related to cybersecurity. I'm a CEH, or Certified Ethical Hacker, and a CISSP. And I don't have my own podcast, but I'm an avid listener of the 443 with Mark. And if you're very technical, I would highly recommend listening to it. It's very good. There's 3 attacks I'm going to go through, and the first one involved ransomware. There were 30 locations impacted by this. Dozens of servers were encrypted, and hundreds of workstations were encrypted. And when we were brought in, there was no EDR in place. They just had legacy antivirus. And as you know, most malware can get right past that from what Mark told us earlier. The first thing we did was we deployed an EDR to all endpoints, and we turned on this application control, or the 100% attestation that Mark was talking about. And if you see on the screenshot here, there were over 68,000 programs classified. 98% of them turned out to be trusted, legitimate programs, but there were almost 1,400 pieces of malware found actively running on the network. And so the attestation was very key in getting control over what was going on in that network. One of the benefits of EDR is beyond just the control and detection capabilities is the intelligence we get. It's very key to use that to get an attacker off of a network. And let me zoom in on this screenshot here. So this is from the EDR we were using, and sorry if it's a little bit blurry here, but you see the icon in red. This was a file that was flagged as suspicious at the time. We weren't sure what it was. It turned out to be fine, but at the time we weren't sure, so we looked into it. And with the EDR, we can see exactly everything that file did. So we can see all the registry keys that file modified, all of the IP addresses that it connected to, and it geolocates them for us so we can see where they were located. We can see other processes that this file ran, and not on the screenshot, but we can also see all of the other endpoints that this file was detected on. So this is excellent as far as investigating an incident. And at the bottom here, you'll see there's a timeline. This is a point in time screenshot. On the next slide here, I've got a little video if it will play. This was from another incident more recently, but it's a similar process here. So the red icon here is PowerShell.exe. And we can see, again, everything that was doing. And I know there's a lot on here, but this is just to demonstrate really the power of having all of this information readily available. It's very, very important to have that. And then lastly, the same incident. So we worked on it for a few weeks, and using the 100% attestation service, we were able to, get to a point where all files running on the endpoints that were protected, the files were legitimate. There was no more malware being detected on them. However, we were still seeing some attacks coming in. This screenshot is from the logs, and if you see what I've highlighted here on the right-hand side, we have infection source IP address. These are all internal IP addresses, and it lists the user. In each case, it was Citrix user. So these were internal IP addresses of devices. We didn't know what these were at the time. They were attacking our protected workstations and servers. So we worked with this company to identify what these were. And again, they had 30 sites. So these were devices scattered across the upper Midwest. And what these turned out to be were thin clients. Thin clients are basically scaled back computers that are only used for a single purpose. And that's remoting into a Citrix server or a terminal server. So in this case, it was a Citrix server, and they all use the same user account. And these machines had no Windows updates on them. They had no endpoint agents, no EDR, nothing on them. So they were very easy for attackers to take control of. And even though these didn't have EDR on them, because we had EDR on the other systems that were protected, we're able to see this and ultimately remediate the issue. The second attack I'm going to go over also involves ransomware. This was more recently during the height of COVID, when a lot of workers were working from home. So there was only one physical location impacted, but remote staff were impacted, and no EDR in place in this as well. And when I say remote staff was impacted, what I mean by that is users that were at home with their laptops had their files being encrypted there, and they were encrypting OneDrive and SharePoint files that were then replicating to other users via synchronization. And one of the key tools we use from the EDR to troubleshoot and take care of this incident is the visibility we get into PowerShell. As Mark mentioned, PowerShell is one of the most common techniques attackers use nowadays. And with the EDR, we're able to monitor all PowerShell commands that were run. And we're able to perform a threat hunt in the EDR looking for suspicious PowerShell commands. And we ultimately found this. This is a PowerShell command that's downloading basically a malicious DLL file into the Windows temp directory and then executing it. And we're able to identify all the machines this was running on. This gave us greater visibility into what was happening. Coincidentally, right as we were working with this local business on this, they were contacted by the FBI, and they had been monitoring a threat actor group and had seen some communication between the threat actors' IP addresses and the client. So I've heavily redacted this. I don't want to get in trouble from the FBI, and I should state all of the information in here is public knowledge now. It wasn't at that point, so we had to keep this hush, but I don't want to get in trouble in case they're watching. So at any rate, what they provided us were some IP addresses and domain names that were associated with this threat actor group. And because we had deployed the EDR a few days prior at this point, we were able to go back in time, and we had already identified these hosts as being infected and got them removed from the network. But we were able to go back in time and verify which endpoints had been communicating with these command and control servers used by this threat actor group. And this gave us confidence that we had remediated or got the attackers out of the network. And at that point, we're able to start beginning to restore service. And one thing I want to point out is it's excellent to be able to do this with your EDR or endpoint protection application, because it's one thing to do this on your firewall to protect endpoints in your office from connecting to these. But because this was during the height of COVID, everyone was remote, and we're able to identify and stop devices that were connecting to these regardless of where they were at. And how we're able to do that, there were a couple examples where there were staff who had their computers at home and they weren't responding. I think in one case, actually, someone was on vacation. We're able to use the EDR to isolate that computer so it could no longer communicate with the internet. The only thing it could communicate with was our EDR, so we could continue to troubleshoot and take care of it, and then ultimately get these offline. And the isolation is really one of the key features of any EDR product, and it comes in very, very handy. The last example I have, this was a brute force attack, and this thankfully was in a case where they had an EDR in place. Just goes to show like Mark said, there's no silver bullet for security. Attacks can be successful and penetrate your initial defenses, but this is where having the multiple layers come into play. So the device being attacked had an EDR on it, and because we have all the logs from everything that's happening, the EDR is going to correlate what's happening. And you see here, I should have highlighted this, but if you look in the upper part, hopefully you can see my mouse moving, there are over 38 million events in the last month that were analyzed by the EDR. And out of those, needle in the haystack, basically, there were 2 indicators of attack that signaled that a brute force attack was happening. The EDR notified us that this was happening. And if it weren't for that, this likely would have ultimately led to initial access and then potentially ransomware or something more serious. A little more details on this particular attack. So the EDR not only told us that there was a brute force attack happening, we could then see the IP address of the device that was attacking them, how many times it had occurred, and it was very easy to remediate this and take care of it before something happened. So that's all I have for the examples, and so we can kick it over to any questions you guys might have.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, as I mentioned in the chat, if you want to use the raise hand feature or just shoot a question through the chat, we're happy to answer that now. Looks like we have a shy bunch. Oh, I'm seeing a hand raised. James, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
So if one of the keys is to pay attention to scripts that are running on endpoints throughout your network, what's an efficient way to separate the good scripts from the bad, evil scripts?
Yeah, and so that is a great question, James, and that's really where the endpoint protection and endpoint detection response engine kind of shines. Like when I say you need to pay attention to scripts, I'm not saying like you specifically need to watch every script that's running, because that would be impossible. It would be a nightmare. And instead, you rely on engines that are capable of analyzing that on their own. So like with the Panda security one that Chris just highlighted, using a contextual engine to identify whether something is potentially malicious or not. And then based off of the engine's own detections, then you can either have it automatically respond and remediate, or potentially just raise flags and alerts for you to investigate on your own. But yeah, it's one of those things where, we aren't in the days of a SOC analyst sitting there and reading logs raw as they roll through systems and firewalls anymore. We really need to lean on our more technical tools like EDR, EPP, to make that own determination and then raise alerts for us to go and investigate. Great question, though. Well, yeah, if anyone has any other questions, feel free to pitch them our way. Like Chris said, like I said earlier, if you have any other questions, you can send them to me. I'm first dot last name at WatchGuard. You can reach out to Success as well if you need any assistance from them. Definitely check out that podcast Chris mentioned, the 443 podcast. Thanks again for pimping that out for me, Chris.
No problem.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for hopping on here.
Thanks, everyone. Yes, we will be sending the slides in the post-event email along with the event recording. So you'll have all this information at your fingertips. No problem. I hope everyone enjoys their lunch and has a great rest of their week. Bye.
All right. Thank you, guys.
See you, everyone. Bye.